Adam sat in his small office, the clutter of old books, discarded drafts, and unopened mail scattered around him. The faint hum of his laptop was the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. He stared blankly at the screen. A few sentences had been written, but nothing came together. The creative spark, the fire that had once driven him to write with passion, was absent. It had been months since he'd finished his last novel. Now, all he had was a vague outline for a story that felt more like a distant dream than an achievable goal. His wife, Laura, was never far from his mind. They had been married for 10 years. At first, everything had seemed perfect. Adam had been the successful writer, and Laura, a brilliant psychologist, had a thriving practice. Together, they made a perfect pair. But somewhere along the way, the connection between them began to fray. It wasn't the big things that had changed, at least not at first. No dramatic arguments, no fights over infidelity. It was the small, quiet moments that slipped through the cracks. The way Laura no longer listened when he spoke, the way her laughter seemed forced. And Adam, so focused on his writing, had failed to notice the gradual drift. His mind was consumed with the pursuit of his next great novel, and he had no time for the woman he had once adored. But now it was different. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Every evening, when Laura came home from work, she was tired, distant. She'd say hello, kiss him on the cheek, and retreat into her study. There was no warmth in her touch, no longing in her eyes. They would eat dinner in silence, their daughter, Lily, chattering away, filling the space between them with her innocent energy. But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental that neither of them had addressed. On nights when Laura stayed late at work, Adam found himself wandering through the house, restless, unsure of what to do with the weight of his thoughts. He had started reading her journals once again, something he hadn't done in years. It was a habit he had formed early in their marriage, sneaking peeks into her private thoughts when he felt disconnected. It was wrong, he knew that, but the temptation had always been too strong. In her words, he had once found a map to the woman he had fallen in love with. But this time, things were different. The journals were filled with professional notes, patient details, and reflections on her career. There was little mention of him. No mentions of shared memories or feelings for their life together. Adam had always known that Laura's career was important to her, but now, it seemed like it had eclipsed everything else. And there was something else too. A phrase kept repeating in her notes. I need to feel alive again. Adam didn't know what it meant. It made his stomach turn with unease. It was around that time that he noticed the small changes. The late nights at work had started to coincide with weekends away. Laura had started taking more frequent trips to conferences and workshops, things she never used to do before. She would return late, always looking a little different, more polished, more tired, as if she had been carrying some unspoken weight with her. Adam didn't confront her right away. He didn't want to seem paranoid, but he couldn't stop wondering, what was it that she needed? What was missing in their life that had made her search elsewhere? The questions gnawed at him. One evening, as Adam was leaving his study to prepare dinner, he found Laura standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her face was unreadable, and for the first time in a long while, Adam felt a pang of concern. He hadn't seen her this distant in a while, and something told him that this moment was different. She was lost in thought, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Laura! Adam's voice broke the silence. She turned slowly, offering him a tight smile. I was just thinking, she said softly, her voice distant. About what? Adam asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated for a moment, and in that moment, Adam realized that something had shifted, a crack in the facade that had been so carefully maintained for years. I don't know, just everything. Our life, my work. I guess I'm just overwhelmed. Adam studied her for a moment, his heart heavy with the words that were already forming in his mind. But he couldn't bring himself to ask the question that had been on the tip of his tongue for weeks. Instead, he simply nodded and walked past her to start dinner. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Adam sat down on the couch, his mind racing. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he could feel the distance between him and Laura now, clearer than ever. Something had changed, something he could no longer ignore. And the fear that had been building inside him finally gave way to suspicion. Was it possible that Laura was changing in ways he hadn't seen? As he stared into the darkness of the room, Adam realized that he couldn't keep living in the silence anymore. The questions couldn't go unanswered. But how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? The following days passed in a blur, each one feeling strangely disconnected from the next. Adam couldn't shake the feeling that his marriage, his life, was falling apart at the edges. His creative block had only worsened, and he found himself increasingly distracted by the small, almost imperceptible shifts in Laura's behavior. Her late nights, her unexplained absences, none of it added up, and yet he couldn't bring himself to confront her. One afternoon, after dropping Lily off at school, Adam took a walk through the neighborhood, trying to clear his head. His thoughts were a chaotic tangle, the knots of suspicion growing tighter with each passing day. It had always been so easy to ignore the small signs, the subtle disconnects between him and Laura. But now, they loomed large, undeniable. When he returned home, Laura was already there. She was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing some paperwork, her focus intense. Adam hesitated in the doorway, watching her. For a moment, he considered saying something, asking her if everything was okay, if there was something she needed to talk about. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he poured himself a coffee, letting the silence stretch between them. The tension was almost tangible now, like a thick fog hanging in the air. "Do you need anything?" he finally asked, his voice tentative. Laura looked up from her papers, her gaze fleeting but distant. "No, I'm fine. Just a little caught up with work." She didn't look at him as she said it, and there was something in her tone that sounded rehearsed, like a well-worn script. Adam tried not to let his mind wander, but the feeling of something being off was inescapable. He felt like he was on the outside of their marriage, watching it from a distance. That night, after dinner, when they settled in front of the TV, Adam had another thought. What if he was just overthinking everything? Perhaps Laura was simply tired, stressed. People change over time after all. It was possible that he was the one who had failed to notice how much had shifted. He hadn't exactly been the most attentive husband in recent months. But that night, something else happened that made his suspicions take root in a way they hadn't before. As Laura went to bed, she left her phone on the kitchen counter. It buzzed once, then twice, the screen lighting up with a name Adam didn't recognize. He told himself to ignore it. He didn't want to invade her privacy, not again. But the nagging feeling in his gut was too strong. Without thinking, he picked up the phone. The message was brief but striking. "I miss you." Adam's pulse quickened. His hand shook as he read it again, trying to make sense of the words. His mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize what he had just seen. Laura had never been the type to keep her phone hidden. In fact, they had always been open about their digital lives, never feeling the need to keep secrets. But this was different. He scrolled through the message history, his heart sinking with each new revelation. There were more messages, all of them affectionate, even flirtatious. The sender's name, Adam noted it quickly, was Ethan. It was clear from the tone of the conversation that they had shared more than just friendly exchanges. There were references to meetings, to dinners, to special moments. Adam's stomach turned as he realized the depth of the betrayal. He immediately regretted picking up the phone. His hands were clammy as he set it back down on the counter. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. Adam's mind was spinning. He felt both nauseated and oddly detached, as if everything had stopped making sense. He had found the evidence, there was no denying it. But in some strange way, it didn't feel real. The reality of what he had discovered seemed surreal, almost like a cruel joke. He stayed in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to confront Laura right away, to demand the truth. But another part of him, a quieter, darker part, told him to wait, to observe. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand people, to read between the lines. Now more than ever, he wanted to understand what was really going on. The next few days were marked by a strange kind of tension. Adam avoided confronting Laura, even though the truth weighed heavily on him. Instead, he took to studying her, watching her movements, her words, her reactions to him. Every glance, every gesture felt like a coded message that he was desperately trying to decode. Laura, on her part, seemed almost oblivious to the shift. She continued her routine as if nothing had changed. But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when Adam saw the cracks. The way she looked at him, just a second too long, as if trying to figure out if he knew. The nervous laughter, the way she brushed off his questions with too much ease. One night, after dinner, Adam found himself sitting alone in their living room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. Laura had gone out for yet another work event, leaving him to his thoughts. The feeling of isolation pressed down on him. He could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening. There was no longer any pretending. Adam knew that he had to confront her, to confront this mess that had become their life. But the truth was more complicated than he had ever imagined. It had been nearly a week since Adam had discovered the texts, and the silence between him and Laura had grown unbearable. He had stayed in the house, observing her movements, questioning every word she said, every look she gave him. But still, he said nothing. His thoughts were a whirlwind, a chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and, strangely, curiosity. The more he observed, the less clear everything seemed. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, hurt, or merely lost. Laura, for her part, remained outwardly unchanged. She still left for her work events, returned late, and spent most of her time lost in her own world, even when she was home. Adam had started to wonder if this had been going on for longer than he had realized. Had she been lying to him all this time? Or was there something more to the affair? And then, one evening, when the weight of the unspoken between them became too much, Laura returned home earlier than usual. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. She dropped her bag by the door without a word, walking past Adam as though she hadn't even seen him. "Laura," Adam said quietly, his voice trembling slightly as the tension finally broke through. She stopped, her back still to him, her shoulders stiff. She didn't turn around immediately, but after a moment, she let out a soft sigh. "What is it, Adam?" Her voice was weary, as if she had been preparing for this conversation for some time, though she hadn't yet acknowledged it aloud. Adam took a step toward her, the space between them feeling almost insurmountable. "You don't have to pretend anymore." "I know." Laura didn't flinch. She didn't even turn to face him. Instead, she stood still, her breath shallow. There was a long pause. For a moment, Adam thought she might deny it, or perhaps blame him. But then, in a voice colder than he had ever heard it before, she said, "I wasn't pretending, Adam. I wasn't pretending for a long time." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't the denial he expected, nor was it the anger he had braced himself for. It was the coldness, the way she spoke, as if there was no longer any attachment to the man standing in front of her. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though his heart was pounding. She turned to face him then, and for the first time in days, their eyes met. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look guilty. She looked tired, as though the weight of the secret had finally exhausted her. "A long time," she said, "maybe longer than you realize. I didn't cheat because I didn't love you, Adam. I cheated because I had to. I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I wasn't." Adam's mind was spinning. He wanted to shout, to demand that she explain herself, to make sense of this tangled mess she had created. But there was something about her words that made him pause. "Had to," he repeated, his voice faltering. "Had to? What are you talking about?" Laura took a deep breath and sat down on the couch. She patted the seat beside her, inviting Adam to sit. He hesitated, but then he did, though there was a deep unease in his stomach. "I've been lost for a long time, Adam," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "When we first got married, I was so sure of myself, of my place in the world. But over time, something changed. I became more focused on my career, and I started to neglect myself. I didn't even realize how much I had been suppressing, how much I had been holding inside." Adam felt a cold chill run through him as he listened, though he didn't interrupt. He wanted to ask about Ethan, to confront her about the affair, but somehow, this new explanation felt even more disturbing than the idea of betrayal itself. "I thought I could manage," Laura continued, "that I could keep everything balanced. But over the years, I started feeling like I was losing myself. I started resenting everything, the house, the family, even you. I didn't know how to get out of it. So I found something else, someone else. It wasn't about you, Adam. It wasn't about not loving you. It was about me. I needed to feel alive again, to feel like I wasn't just fading away." Adam sat there, stunned, unable to form a coherent thought. He had expected anger, an apology, or at least some explanation that would make sense. But what Laura had just said didn't make sense to him at all. It felt like an excuse, a justification, a way of shifting the blame. Is that all? He asked finally, his voice sharp with disbelief. You were just lost? So you decided to sleep with someone else? Laura didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him with a strange mixture of sorrow and resignation. It wasn't that simple, she said quietly. But yes, in the end, that's what it came down to. I was looking for something I couldn't find in our marriage. And now, I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to come back from that. Adam's head was spinning. He had always known their marriage wasn't perfect, but he had never thought it could be this broken. The truth, as ugly and painful as it was, had forced its way into their lives like a force of nature, and now they were left to face the wreckage. I don't know if I can forgive you, Laura, Adam said, his voice hoarse. I don't know if I even want to. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. I understand. I didn't expect you to forgive me right away, if at all, but I had to tell you the truth. There was another long silence between them. Adam didn't know what to say, what to feel. His emotions were tangled up in knots, none of them clear enough to untangle. He had suspected, yes, but hearing it from her, hearing the raw honesty of her confession, made everything feel even more impossible to process. And yet, as he sat there, looking at his wife, he realized something else, something that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. This wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't even just about Laura's betrayal. It was about him too, about what he had become, about what he had allowed their marriage to become. The room felt smaller now, suffocating even, as Adam tried to process everything Laura had just revealed. His mind was racing, unable to settle on one coherent thought. He had expected an explosion, anger, accusations, maybe even tears. But this calm, almost detached admission from Laura shook him more than anything. I don't know how we fix this, Adam, Laura said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Her voice was small, but there was an edge to it, as though she were ready to hear whatever verdict he was about to deliver. Adam looked at her, the woman he had shared 10 years of his life with, now a stranger. He had always believed that, no matter how things got, they would face it together. But the distance between them now felt insurmountable. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now seemed to look past him, as though already preparing for the end. So, what now? Adam asked, his voice edged with disbelief. You tell me this, and what am I supposed to do with it? I'm supposed to just accept it? Laura flinched at his words. No, Adam. I'm not asking you to accept anything. I'm just telling you the truth. I've been living a lie for so long. I thought maybe telling you would be the first step to finding something real again. Something inside Adam snapped. The anger that had been building inside him couldn't be ignored any longer. Finding something real? He repeated, incredulous. After everything? After betraying me, lying to me for months, you think you get to define what's real? Laura didn't reply, but Adam saw the flicker of regret in her eyes. It wasn't enough to silence him, though. The betrayal had cut too deep. I've given so much of myself to you, Laura, he continued, his voice shaking. I let this go on without questioning it, without confronting it. And now you tell me it was because you lost yourself? What about me? What about this family? Laura stood up abruptly, her body stiff with tension. She walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. I don't have answers, Adam. I don't know how to fix this. But pretending it wasn't happening wasn't helping either. I was suffocating in this marriage, and I didn't know how to breathe again. Adam's heart was heavy with a mix of rage and heartbreak. He had been living in a dream, a fantasy, where everything was okay. But now, that dream was shattered, and all that remained was the truth, brutal, messy, and undeniable. What do we do now? He asked again, his voice more resigned than before. Laura turned around, her face pale, eyes red from unshed tears. She looked at him, and for the first time in days, there was something softer there. Vulnerability, maybe even a hint of regret. I don't know, Adam, but I can't live like this anymore. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I think it's time we face the truth. Together or apart. Adam's stomach twisted at her words. She had already made up her mind, hadn't she? She was ready to walk away from this, from him. The thought of losing her, of their family breaking apart, was like a cold weight sinking in his chest. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "We can't keep living like this." Laura's face faltered, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Adam could see it in her eyes, the finality of the moment. The marriage they had built was collapsing. There was no going back. The next few days were filled with a tense silence. Laura was still there, physically, but emotionally, it felt as though she had already left. Adam could no longer pretend that they were just going through a rough patch. This was something deeper, something irreversible. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything that had been neglected, all the things they hadn't said, all the things they hadn't faced. One night, after a long day of avoidance and silence, Adam sat down with his journal. Writing had always been his refuge, a place where he could pour his thoughts onto the page and make sense of them. But tonight there was nothing. No words would come. He stared at the blank page, wondering if anything would ever come together again. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke his concentration. It was Laura. She appeared in the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure of what to say or how to bridge the vast distance between them. For a moment, she said nothing, just watching him, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens next, about what we do now." Adam closed the journal with a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't want to hear more of her explanations. "Not now. I don't know, Laura. I don't know what happens now. We can't go back to how it was. We can't pretend." Laura nodded, looking down. "I know. I'm not asking you to." For the first time, Adam saw something in her eyes, guilt, yes, but also something else. Maybe even hope. "I think we need time," she said quietly. "Time to figure out who we are without each other. Maybe that's the only way to move forward." Adam didn't respond right away. He didn't know how. He was still processing everything, still reeling from the discovery of the affair, from the reality of the woman he had shared his life with no longer existing in the way he had imagined. Laura waited for his answer, but when none came, she turned and left the room. As she disappeared into the hallway, Adam felt a strange mix of relief and loss. There was no resolution yet, no finality, only a deep uncertainty about what was to come. But one thing was clear. Everything had changed. The days after that conversation felt like they were moving through thick fog. Adam couldn't remember when things had become so complicated, so painful. It seemed like a lifetime ago that they had shared laughs, quiet moments, and dreams about the future. Now, everything felt fractured, 1,000 pieces scattered around them that neither knew how to put back together. Laura moved out of their bedroom not long after. She began spending more time at her office, or out with friends she hadn't spoken about in years. The silence between them was deafening, but it was also a strange kind of peace. For the first time in a long while, neither of them tried to fill the air with false words or empty gestures. They existed in parallel, both lost in their own thoughts, too tired to fight anymore. Adam spent his days in the studio, staring at canvases he could no longer bring himself to touch. The creative block that had started in the weeks before Laura's confession had become all-consuming. He didn't know what to paint anymore, didn't know who he was painting for. The once clear lines between his art and his life had blurred. His personal world, once rich with meaning, now felt like an empty canvas, waiting for something to happen. It was during one of these long, solitary evenings in the studio that Adam found himself staring at an unfinished painting on the wall, a portrait of Laura from years ago, bright and full of hope. She had always told him it was her favorite. He hadn't been able to finish it then, too consumed by other projects, but he had kept it all these years. It felt like the last piece of a life he had once known. Now, seeing it again, he realized how much he had missed. Not just the woman in the painting, but the person he used to be, the artist who saw beauty and possibility in everything, who was open to love without fear of its inevitable collapse. But that version of him felt distant now, as distant as the woman who had once stood by his side. Adam's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Lily's school, parent-teacher meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. The message was like a jolt of reality. Amidst everything, they still had to figure out how to be parents together. The thought of interacting with Laura, of coexisting without pretending everything was fine, felt nearly impossible, but it had to be done, for Lily's sake. The meeting was quiet, the air thick with the tension neither of them had yet addressed. They spoke briefly to the teacher about Lily's progress, but Adam noticed the awkwardness in their exchanges. The old rhythm of their conversations was gone. Laura was distant, her eyes often drifting to the floor or the clock, as though she was eager to escape. Adam was the same, only his discomfort came in waves, overwhelming him in moments when he least expected it. After the meeting, they walked out together in silence. The evening was cool, the air crisp with the change of seasons. They reached the parking lot and stopped, both of them unsure of how to proceed. "You're still staying at your sister's, right?" Adam asked, his voice quieter than usual. Laura nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, it's not permanent, but I think I need some space." Adam didn't know if he could give her the space she needed, not when everything between them was still so raw. But he couldn't stop her, could he? What was left between them but the faint memory of what they once had? "I don't know what to say, Laura," he muttered, the words feeling heavy. "I don't know if we can fix this." "I don't know either," she replied, finally looking up at him, her eyes soft but weary. "Maybe we can't, but maybe that's okay. Maybe it's better this way." Adam's heart clenched at the finality of her words, the weight of their meaning sinking in. "You're right," he whispered. "Maybe it is." And with that, they said nothing more. Adam climbed into his car and drove away, leaving Laura standing there, watching him go. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet decisions. Adam began to take small steps to reclaim parts of his life. He spent more time painting, though nothing felt quite the same. The act of creating was still a struggle, but it was no longer out of reach. Slowly, the colors began to return to his work. Slowly, he started to rebuild a version of himself that wasn't entirely defined by his relationship with Laura. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to settle into a life apart from him, though it was clear she wasn't entirely at peace. Her visits with Lily were still frequent, but she never stayed long, never lingered in the house for more than the time it took to help with homework or make dinner. They still saw each other, at parent-teacher meetings, or when Lily's birthday came around, but each interaction was a reminder that their lives were no longer intertwined. The finality of their situation had become clearer with each passing day. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive moments of clarity. It was a slow, inevitable drift, an unraveling of something that had been damaged beyond repair. One day, as Adam was sitting in his studio, staring at a fresh canvas, he realized something. He hadn't painted for anyone in a long time. Not for Laura, not for his career, not for anyone. He painted because it was a way to feel, to connect with something outside of himself, to make sense of a world that often didn't make sense at all. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all he needed, to be able to create, to rebuild, to rediscover who he was outside of the life he had once built with Laura. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Adam felt a glimmer of hope. Not for the marriage that was lost, but for the possibility of finding something new, something he had lost sight of in the years of keeping everything together.